This morning and tomorrow we have Professor Lee.
That's right, sir.
Please state your full name.
Christine Ann Lee.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm,
and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Professor Lee, I'm going to start just by asking you a few questions about your career. You studied medicine at Oxford, is that right?
Yes,
And then you held various house officer posts in the early 1970s.
yes,
You began your haematology training in September 1974. Was that at St Mary's, London?
yes, St Mary's, Harrow Road, London, yes.
And you were a registrar there. The consultant was Dr. Fielding, is that right?
Yes,
And that was something that you did until 1976. You then moved to St George's as a senior registrar in November 1976.
yes,
And you remained there until December 1982.
yes,
You told the Lindsay Inquiry that it was at St George's that you became particularly interested in haemophilia, is that right?
yes,
Now, you spent during that time, I think, some 10 months or so at the South London Transfusion Centre.
yes, I was working part-time. So I was working 2.5 days a week there for my training for MRC Path.
And that was the Tooting Centre?
Sorry, the
Was that
teaching-
the centre in Tooting, the Regional
Yes, sorry,
Transfusion
yes.
Centre? Can you recall who the director was of the Transfusion Centre?
No,
You've said in your statement that you would have understood at that time the risks of transfusion-acquired infection. Now, I'll come on to knowledge of risks of infection in more detail later, but can you recall what, if anything, was discussed or taught about that issue at the Transfusion Centre?
it would have been the generality of the infections that were known at that time.
Do you recall any particular impression of the centre at Tooting and how it was run?
No,
Do you recall whether there were any shortages or supply issues? We've heard from Dr. Winter that by the time he was dealing with the Tooting Centre, there were difficulties because they were covering both the South East and South West regions. Were you aware of that?
no,
You then moved to the Royal Free Hospital at the end of 1982, beginning of 1983. Is that right?
perhaps I should explain I was given the appointment at the end of 1982. I actually took up the appointment at the end of January 1983.
And the post was entitled Research Senior Registrar. Is that correct?
That's right.
How did you come to apply for that job?
The job was advertised by being sent to all the haematologists in the London region. And Professor Peter Flute, gave me the description of it, and that has been submitted in the papers.
Yes, we'll look at that in a moment. Had you known or worked with Dr. Kernoff or Dr. Howard Thomas before?
Sorry, had I?
Had you known or worked with either Dr. Peter Kernoff or Dr. Howard Thomas before?
When I did a neurology SHO post in 1971 for 6 months at the Churchill Hospital in Oxford, I was doing neurology, and Dr. Peter Kernoff at that time, I think, was doing his MD on inhibitors with Dr. Ritzer, and the Haemophilia Centre at the Churchill Hospital, which incidentally is where I trained in Oxford Medical School, and the Haemophilia Centre was on the same site, and occasionally I would see him because we had ward rounds to train us to take membership of the Royal College of Physicians. So that was how I knew him at that time.
And had you known Dr. Howard Thomas before you applied?
Dr. Howard Thomas was a colleague of my husband in the Department of Medicine at the Royal Free when Dame Sheila Sherlock headed up that department. And he was a professional colleague of my husband. We did know him socially.
We're just going to look at a couple of documents. The application Dr. Kernoff made for a grant for the post that you took up and the job description. Henry, could we have, please, WITN 0644062, please? This is one of the exhibits to your witness statement, Professor Lee. And we can see, if we see the whole page, please, Henry. This is a grant application to Action Research for the Crippled Child. Could you just explain what Action Research was?
It was a charitable trust that awarded monies for research. And as you can see from the title there, at the time, it was called Action Research for the Crippled Child, which is rather insensitive, and that has now been dropped. But as I understand it, I think it still exists. And I imagine it was applied for because haemophilia before treating caused great disablement.
And we can see that the application this is November 1981, in fact, so obviously before you saw the post advertised and applied. It's called Aspects of the Natural History of Liver Disease and Haemophilia. I'm just going to ask you to turn to a few pages. I want to get a sense of the work that you were doing at the Royal Free under this post. If we go to page 4, please, Henry. So we can see under the heading Objectives, if you want to zoom in on that paragraph, please, Henry. And if we could just see the whole paragraph under the heading Objectives. No, sorry, could we just see the whole of that section too? Thank you. There are 3 objectives there set out as the objectives of the post. To use a newly developed radioimmunoassay for immunological markers of non-A, non-B hepatitis, to study the natural history of acute and chronic non-A, non-B hepatitis in haemophiliacs, the antigen-antibody content of different preparations of clotting factor concentrates, the transmissibility of non-A, non-B infection to household contacts of haemophiliacs, and the antigen-antibody content of different preparations of pooled immunoglobulin. And just pausing there, is that an accurate description of part of what you were doing when you took up the post?
This work I was not doing. This work was conducted in the Department of Medicine on samples, and I wasn't involved in that.
2.2, were you involved in what's set out there, which involved ultrasound scanning, or was that again in the Department of Medicine?
No, I'm sure we're going to move on to this, but these were 2 ways in which progression of liver disease could be looked at by non-invasive methods, so avoiding liver biopsy essentially. And there is a paper in my submission that records the results of this, but it was published much later, and it was effective to some extent.
Yes, we'll come on to look at that paper at a later stage of your
Yes.
evidence, Professor Lee. Just trying to get a sense of what the aim of the work was. 2.3 was to make a detailed evaluation of patients treated with pooled immunoglobulin, and then to make a detailed evaluation of the response to steroid therapy in patients with severe chronic liver disease, and if appropriate, to establish a multi-centre controlled trial. Was that part of the work which you undertook?
No, I need to just take a little bit of time here. Most of the patients had been seen before my post essentially was looking retrospectively at the data. The study that I analysed, obviously with Dr. Kernoff's supervision, the patients had been treated, and most of them had been treated actually before I even set foot in the centre. And I think this document you've got is the application.
Yes.
And actually what was done was not necessarily what was in the application. I'm sure we're going to move on to discuss it, but the information in this significant paper that came out of the evaluation had largely been in the notes before I even started.
Yes, we will come on to the paper, but
Yes.
at the moment I'm just trying to get a sense of what the work was that you were asked
Yes,
to undertake.
but I just want to emphasise again that this is the application
Yes.
for the grant, and actually what I ended up doing was not necessarily what's in this application.
Well, if we just look at a couple more passages in this, and then we'll look at the job description, which was the job description
Yes,
that you
I
answered.
think that's probably a better description, really.
If we just look at the next page, please, Henry, before we leave this document, we can see on the, if we have the first half of the page, please. We can see there, there's a description of, at C, patients to be studied are registered at the Royal Free Hospital Haemophilia Centre. Now, you did some work at a later stage with Dr. Ritzer, I'll come back to that. But for the purposes of this study and the work that you were initially engaged to carry out, it was all relating to patients at the Royal Free, was it?
Yes.
We can see there it said all age groups represented. About 200 patients receive infusions of blood products in any 1 year. All patients receiving infusion therapy are reviewed at frequent intervals, and detailed information about types and amounts of blood products given and sequential changes in biochemical and immunological tests is available for a period of several years in most patients and a lifetime in many. If we skip down a few lines, we can see it then says a large bank of stored sera is maintained. Is it correct that the stored sera had been maintained since 1978?
Yes, the stored sera came into practice in 1978 when Dr. Kernoff took up his tenure as director of the centre. And I think it's important to just expand on this a little. It had become reported, and people were aware that there was a transaminitis, abnormal transaminases in people who were having concentrates. And Dr. Kernoff had come from Oxford. He'd done research with through Dr. Ritzer. And the idea of storing sera was in order to, in the future, if a test became available, be able to see what was happening. I think at this stage it might also be important to make a point about the first paper, which was published in the year of my birth in 1943 by Paul Beeson, who was the professor of medicine when I was a student there, he, at the end of that paper, which reported 7 cases of people who had got jaundiced, and the common factor was a blood transfusion. This is 1943, no tests. And he said, it's important that doctors begin to understand this, and they should note down the details of the transfusion, and they should store a specimen of it for future use. So the idea was really to understand what was happening. And it became a regular part of the whole practice of treating and caring for people with haemophilia at that time. And this went on, and it proved extremely helpful in understanding these diseases.
We'll come back to that in more detail at a later stage. If we just go on to the next page, please, Henry. Go to the bottom of the page under the heading Reasons for Support Requested. So we can see, again, this is the grant application, but what's said there is that the medical registrar will be involved in the day-to-day supervision of patients included in the clinical studies and in the collection and analysis of clinical and laboratory data. That's a description of what was intended for the post that you then took up. So you were involved not simply in the collection, or the intention was you would be involved not simply in the collection and analysis of data, but also day-to-day supervision of patients. Is that right?
No, that's not true. What I was involved in, the patients had already been treated in the context of a bleeding episode, and I was involved in analysing the liver function tests, the treatment they'd had, and their clinical symptoms from the notes and from the results in the notes. I can't remember the detail of it, but I think there was only about 1 or 2 patients within that short frame. The study, if you look, finished it was 78 to 83. And the actual patients who'd had treatment that I followed, there were about 2 out of the over 58. These patients had all been treated for something that was bleeding associated. They weren't chosen. And the significant thing about this study is that these people had not been treated a lot before. So they were first treatment patients. So it was possible at that time, the only way you could diagnose non-A, non-B hepatitis was you had to have an increase in the liver function tests within 1 month of twice normal level, plus exclusion of other causes of hepatitis. And the medical feature of non-A, non-B hepatitis is that it could be asymptomatic, and the transaminases were essentially what's called a yo-yo response. They went up and down. So unless these tests were taken about every 2 weeks for 3 months, you would miss it. And this is what had already been done in these patients under Peter Kernoff's direction. And I took up the remaining ones that were put into this paper, and I analysed what had gone before. The reason for stopping in 83 is because there was a lot of information that needed to be got out there for the benefit of the patients and people treating them.
We'll come back to the details of the study. I'm just trying to get a sense of the work, the day-to-day responsibilities you had, Professor Lee. So if we look at the job description, WITN 0644061. So if we go to the heading Duties of the Post, bottom half of the page, please. So it says there, the main duty of the post holder will be to take a primary responsibility under the direction of Dr. Kernoff and Dr. Thomas for the implementation, coordination, follow-through and completion of the research products which are described in the attached protocols. She will be located in the Haemophilia Centre and will need to acquire a thorough knowledge of the principles of diagnosis and management of patients with congenital coagulation disorders by involvement in the service and academic work of the centre. There will be a strong clinical component to the job, which will include frequent contact with patients with liver disease and their relatives, making appropriate arrangements for their investigation, follow-up and the collection of necessary samples, and possibly establishing combined haemophilia hepatitis clinics. She will be responsible for the collection, recording and analysis of data which will accrue as the studies progress and the final assembly of results for publication. And if we just go to the next paragraph, please, Henry. It then continues, an important component of the post will be to liaise between the Haemophilia Centre and the liver unit, and then various matters set out there, including it will be necessary for the post holder to familiarise him/herself with aspects of liver disease and its management by participation in Department of Medicine meetings, seminars and ward rounds. And then if we just go over the page before I ask you a question, if we can go to the next part of the document. So under the heading Study and Training, the post holder is expected to gain wide experience of clinical and laboratory aspects of bleeding disorders during the tenure of the post, and there will be many opportunities to participate in departmental activities which are not directly associated with the research projects. So is that an accurate description of the job that you took up, Professor Lee?
Not entirely. I think the first thing that hits me that I would like to just make a comment about is the bit about liver biopsy. Before I took up this post, there had been a death from a liver biopsy. And that certainly was not part of what I took on. The only patient who at that time had a liver biopsy was the lady that is reported,
yes,
who had fulminant hepatitis, and it was covered with cryoprecipitate. But I certainly was not trained to do liver biopsies. I never did liver biopsies. The detail of the extent to which I, in practice, got involved in all these things was not quite as extensive as it would appear there, because I took over in the end of January '83, and almost immediately we were consumed by the issue of HIV.
This document suggests that whilst the completion and analysis of the research project was an important part of a key part of the work that the person was being employed to undertake, it was also expected that there would be a clinical component, regular dealings with patients, and learning thoroughly the principles of the diagnosis and management of bleeding disorders. Was that part and parcel of what you did?
I think, I'm sure all the descriptions of the centre are there in my submissions, and almost by osmosis you had to get involved in this. It was a very big centre, so there were teaching sessions and meetings planning about what was happening and who was coming and things like that. But I would just emphasize that the main thing I was doing was analyzing data. And I've just got, I know we're coming on to it, but it's relevant. The study was over a 5-year period from April 1978 to March 1983. And this information was already in the patient notes. And the study was retrospective in the sense these people were not recruited to go into a study. They were people who came with a bleeding problem, and then they were retrospectively identified. And because there had been the collection of the samples and the results of the liver function tests, it was possible to retrospectively analyze that information. The 5-year period went from April 1978, when Peter Kernoff was appointed, and it ended in March 1983 for the purposes of this study. I don't recall exactly the number of patients that I was taking 2 weekly specimens from, but clearly it wasn't very many because there's only a month that they had their treatments.
I understand your evidence that for the purposes of that study, the time period of the patients being treated was coming to an end at the point in time at which you took up your post in January 1983. But following that, what clinical role did you have at the Royal Free 1983-1984? Did you, for example, sit in with Dr. Kernoff when he saw patients with bleeding disorders?
No. No. I think it also has to be understood that the care at the centre was a multidisciplinary team. So there were the consultants, the clinical assistant, Dr. Eleanor Goldman, who I know is making a submission. There were the family therapists, there were the physiotherapists, there were the laboratory staff, and the main day-to-day clinical work was conducted by the senior registrar or registrar who was rotating through the department from the Department of Haematology, who was learning about haemophilia. New patients who came were seen by Dr. Kernoff. I didn't see new patients.
Could we have on screen, please, this is your evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal, Professor Lee, LIND 0000326. And could we go, please, to page 3? You'll see you were being asked, as I am, about the various posts you'd held, and then you give an answer a few lines down. Essentially, I've cared clinically for this group of patients really since the beginning of 1983. The evidence you gave to the Lindsay inquiry suggests you had a clinical role for patients with bleeding disorders from 1983 onwards.
I think a clinical role of taking blood tests or discussing patients within a team is what I was talking about. But I was not the person who saw new patients. I was not the person who made the decision about what treatment should be given to a particular patient. Dr. Kernoff was the director at that time, and I was doing research under him, under his direction. And clearly I would help out if there was somebody who needed to have blood taken or to be clerked. But I just emphasised that it was a team approach. I would also like to just put on record, when I gave information to the Lindsay inquiry, it was 20 years ago. I was working as the director and professor of haemophilia at that time. So I had access to documents. I knew my information. You are asking me about a period in 1983 which on my account is 37 years ago.
It is.
And it's difficult to remember these things.
Do you have a sense or a recollection of how often you had direct patient interaction, other than for the purpose of taking bloods, in the period 1983-1984?
No, I don't have a recollection of the complete number of cases, but I can tell you that once HIV infection began to impact, for example, I can remember a patient, he was the oldest patient who died of HIV infection, and I did look after him when he came up to the centre because we were totally confused about what he had. And so we had to think of all the possible things to test. In retrospect, what he had was pneumocystis carinii, but we didn't know that. So that was the kind of situation that I might be called upon to do clinical work. But the practicalities and organisation at that time was Peter Kernoff was the director. He made the decisions, and there was a junior, well, not so much junior really, it would be a senior registrar or registrar in the department, so that when the patients came up, as they could do any time, that would be the first person who saw them and reviewed the problems, and then would probably discuss with Dr. Kernoff what should be done.
So a new patient typically would be seen by Dr. Kernoff. Existing patients who were returning for review appointments would be seen...
It would depend on what the clinical problem was. You also probably need to know that there was a very well-trained senior nurse, and at that time I can't remember how many exactly nurses there were, but certainly one who very sadly died 2 years ago. But the nurses also would be very involved in the first seeing the patient as they came in. For serious situations, which are the patients, many of the patients all the patients who were treated in this paper, I'm quite certain Dr. Kernoff would have seen them. I think it's also important that you know, I was working part-time, I wasn't on call, I was working 4 days a week then, I think.
And you
so it's very, I think it's very difficult for me to know what Dr. Kernoff was doing 24 hours of the day.
Yes, I'll take you to some documents in due course and ask you about them, which show some of Dr. Kernoff's thinking at the time. But just going back to the question of how the care was organised and structured at the Royal Free in this 1983-1984 period, you've mentioned team discussions. Was that a regular occurrence, that there would be what would now be known probably as multidisciplinary team meetings to discuss patient care?
Can I just refer
yes,
to
of course.
a document here, which you have? This is on record, and in order to just give you an idea of the sort of team working we had.
Sorry, can I just stop you, Professor Lee, so that others can follow? Is that the document, Haemophilia Centre and Hemostasis Unit?
That's right.
Henry, it's WITN 0644069, please.
So this was actually written in 1987 when I returned as a consultant, but it gives a description of the centre. Like, for example, by 1970, the centre had 180 patients. And this was housed in a prefabricated extension and the end of a ward at the old Lawn Road Hospital. And in 1972, they've got 220 patients. The present director, Dr. Kernoff, took up post in 1978. And I think to give you an idea of the the growth is important because that was also reflected in the team that came together. So this is, by 1987, you've got 981 patients in the period 1987 to 88. And this required more staff. So you've got Dr. Kernoff and now Professor Tuttenham, who mainly was in the laboratory doing research, trying to purify factor VIII. You had an associate specialist, Dr. Eleanor Goldman, who tended to see mostly the children, and she was a trained family therapist. You have Reva, she was 92 weeks ago, and I think is giving evidence to you. And Reva Miller, who was called a social worker, but she was a trained family therapist and went on to develop the same-day testing clinic for HIV in the hospital, and also to advise the blood transfusion centre in North London about HIV. There was also a full nursing team. There was the nurse manager, she was called then, was Patricia Lilly. There was a data processing officer because Peter had a computer put in 79-80. There was office manager, there was secretaries, there was a reception coordinator, and there was a full laboratory that did all the specialized tests for our patients, and also had to do the specialized hemostasis tests for the whole hospital. We had a big renal unit, we had a big liver transplant unit, and we had a big emergency department, so that was a big part of it. In terms of the team, would you like me to tell you about the team working? Or
I'm interested in particular in the years 1983 to 1984 for the purposes of my current questions. I understand that most of the people that you've mentioned would have been in post then, so Reva Miller, Dr. Goldman, Dr. Kernoff, Professor Tuddenham. In terms of the clinical decisions that were being taken about, for example, what treatment a particular patient should receive, was that something that was discussed in team meetings in some sense?
I don't recall that, no. I think that those decisions were made by Dr. Kernoff.
We'll come back to a number of these matters, Professor Lee, but just completing the basic chronology of your career. In November of 1984, you went to work at the Charing Cross and Westminster Medical School and Queen Mary University Hospital. Is that right?
I hope it's possible to put this into context. I think it's important because you might wonder why I left something that was very important to me, and I really cared for those patients. And I had two young children. I lived in Richmond, which, for those of you who live in London, may know is very close to Queen Mary's Hospital, Roehampton, which was then a district general hospital that was a university hospital, and there was a post of a senior lecturer in haematology at Charing Cross Medical School, but essentially taking up the single-handed haematology post at Queen Mary's Roehampton. And the previous consultant in haematology had been a laboratory-based haematologist, and I was to change the service because this was happening in haematology for it to be a clinical and a laboratory service. It was a very attractive post to me because there was no definite post at the Royal Free. I was doing research, it was actually quite difficult for me to make this decision, but I did it for family reasons and proximity reasons, really. So I applied for the post and I became the consultant. I was there for 3 years, and during that time, because I was a senior lecturer, the head of the department very kindly, this is at Charing Cross, the professor at Charing Cross, very kindly let me go on secondment for 1 day a week back to the Royal Free, essentially to try and write up information that we had, because it was very important to get this into the public domain for the patients and the people caring for these people. So I think that was 1986, as I remember it, that I started going on a day a week. And then during that time, the workload of HIV and non-A, non-B hepatitis was becoming enormous, and Peter Kernoff made the case within the Royal Free for a consultant where the most responsibilities would be to manage this group of patients. And he eventually succeeded in getting the funding for that, and I applied for it and took it up in November 87. I think, will you enable me now to just sidetrack a little bit what I was doing in this post about HIV, because it is relevant?
Yes.
Or would you prefer me to keep that?
No, that's fine. I'll ask you about that in a moment. Can I just ask you 2 questions before you do that?
Sure,
Just 2 short questions.
Sure.
The first is, in relation to the period 1984 to 1987 when you were at Queen Mary.
Yes.
My understanding from the evidence you've given elsewhere is that you were working initially 1 day a week at the Royal Free,
Yes.
and then from 1986 you did 2 sessions per week at the Royal Free. Does that sound right?
1 day I did. I used to drive over from Richmond to Hampstead, and maybe that was called 2 sessions. I don't know.
It's simply the terminology.
I don't think I was paid. I wasn't paid for that. It may be that because of the regulatory thing within the hospital, Peter had to put in, because I was working there, he might have had to put some kind of documentation into the hospital, because, you know, hospitals don't let people just go and work in a department without the authority. So I imagine that's where the 2 sessions came. But I was not paid. My salary was as a senior lecturer at Charing Cross Hospital.
And in terms of the work you were undertaking at Charing Cross or Queen Mary University Hospital, did you have any responsibility during that period for the care of patients with bleeding disorders?
I think, you know that, well, I'm sure you know, haemophilia occurs in 1 in 10,000 people. During the 3 years I was there was 1 little boy who presented, and I actually referred him to Peter. That was the only person. But of course, you know, haematologists, bleeding disorders aren't just haemophilia. And of course, also at that time, we're talking about 84, our knowledge was perhaps rather rudimentary about other inherited clotting factor deficiencies. But at that time, I didn't have anybody specifically with haemophilia, but because I was the consultant haematologist, if anybody bled in the hospital, I was responsible for trying to diagnose it and tell the laboratory what they should test for. But again, the laboratory at Queen Mary's Roehampton was nothing like the laboratory at the Royal Free, so we did very simple screening tests for bleeding disorders.
So you were a general haematologist in a district general
I looked after
hospital.
the whole of haematology, and as I say, it was quite a challenging post, because haematology was changing. You know, we're doubly trained in haematology. We have what's called MRCP, Membership of the Royal College of Physicians, so we have to have done medicine. And we have to have done a very full laboratory training, which is medical MRC path. And at about that time, previously haematology had been, within pathology, it had been a pathological discipline. But now we were moving to a situation, actually like Scotland had always had, where the haematologist was a clinician and a laboratory person. and I had to change that hospital laboratory to that.
You had wanted to make an observation about the work you did in relation to HIV and AIDS during that period.
We'll be talking about this, I'm sure, but as I remember it, the National Blood Transfusion Service clearly wanted to test blood for HIV, and this became possible in the beginning of 1985. They were very concerned that people would therefore go and give blood in order to get a test. And in order for that not to happen, in every region or district general hospital, I'm not quite sure of the size of the area, they appointed 2 AIDS counsellors, and they were to provide a testing service for HIV, as it were, in the community. And because when I went to Queen Mary's, they knew that I'd had some experience, I was appointed one, and I had an HIV testing clinic that I had to see people with. The other quite extraordinary thing, and I think this is important because it does set the scene of how AIDS and HIV really overwhelmed not just haemophilia, where it was quite tragic, but it overwhelmed the whole country. And I was told to go and address every secondary school in the borough of Richmond upon Thames to educate them about AIDS.
You returned to the Royal Free full-time at the end of 1987, November 1987, as a consultant.
Yes.
And then you took over as acting director in around April of 1991 after Dr. Kernoff was taken suddenly ill.
That's right. And
you then became the director of the centre in April 1992 until your retirement at the end of 2005.
Yes.
We'll come on to these in more detail to some extent at a later stage, but you were a member of the UK HCDO from 1991 to 2005, or before? Yes. 1991?
1991 to 2005.
And you sat on various working parties and groups. We'll look at a couple of those.
Yes.
And you were on the medical advisory panel of the Haemophilia Society between 1993 and 2005.
Yes. I think I was asked in my statement about this. I think what I remember is that David Waters used to phone me periodically, but I can't remember regularly going to meetings of that.
I want to ask you a few questions about St George's, first of all, before we turn to look in more detail again at the Royal Free. So you were at St George's between 1976 and 1982, with the exception of the time you were on secondment for training purposes to the Regional Transfusion Centre.
Can I just interject a little bit? I mean, I'm sorry to get personal about this, but I was actually working part-time. So 6/10 I was working, and it was under a scheme called the Married Women's Scheme. And I had 2 pregnancies during that time. So I was on maternity leave at 2 stages during that time.
St George's was a designated haemophilia centre, not a reference centre, but a small haemophilia centre at the time.
I don't know that because Professor Peter Flute was the professor then. I don't have knowledge of that.
I just want to get a sense of the number of patients and the kind of treatments used there. And we can do that. I can prompt your memory, Professor Lee, by looking at the annual returns. It's HCDO 0000 143_003, please, Henry. And if we go to the next page, please. So this is just to get an idea, because we may not have anybody else that I can ask anything about St George's of. This is the 1983 return, so you'd still have been there in 1983, at least. No, I'm sorry, you'd moved on at the beginning of 1983, but this may give us a flavour. You'd been there in 1982. We can see there 31 haemophilia A patients and 4 von Willebrand's patients, so a much smaller centre than the Royal Free. And then if we look at the products that were used, we can see a small amount of cryoprecipitate, some NHS human factor VIII concentrate used both in hospital and for home treatment. And then the predominant product used there was ARMA factor VIII, and we can see the quantities there, 270,755 for hospital treatment, 309,680 for home treatment. Decisions as to what concentrates to use at St George's, were those taken by Professor Flute?
I do not know.
Do you have any recollection of what the treatment policies were at St George's at that time?
No. I could just comment on
Yes.
these figures. I saw them for the first time, I think, last evening. You see that there's NHS factor VIII and commercial here. It's roughly a third was NHS and 2/3 was commercial, and the national figures were similar to that. But I've never seen that document before. I would have no part in any decisions that Professor Flute made, and of course,
if you work
he's
out the
dead.
figures, it looks more like a fifth.
Sorry?
If you look at the figures,
Yes.
the total there for NHS as opposed to ARMA, it looks to me to be something more in the region of a quarter or a fifth.
Yes, maybe. I think it's not really appropriate for me to comment on Professor Flute's figures. I wouldn't have had anything to do with this. I suppose to follow up on that comment, it just emphasises that much more commercial factor VIII was being used than NHS factor VIII.
As senior registrar and completing your training effectively under Professor Flute, you would presumably, I appreciate what you've said about periods of maternity leave and being part-time, but when you were there, you would presumably have been involved in the clinical care of patients.
Yes, but not an awful lot, actually. A lot of to do MRC path training, you had to rotate through various specialties. So some of the time would be spent, as we've seen from the transfusion centre. There was a whole big several months spent at the Royal Marsden to learn about leukemia. And within St George's, I would occasionally have seen a patient, but my main clinical contact with patients was actually at a district general hospital that was part of the St George's network, St James's Balham, which was saw general haematology, and there I would see patients in the wards, and I ran an outpatient clinic, but I didn't do those things at St George's. And of course there was a large amount of microscope work to screen films. I also, at St George's, was very involved in being trained in the laboratory to do factor VIII assays and things that are relevant to haemophilia. But that wasn't in the context of doing work for patients. It was to actually learn how to do it, because when we did our MRC path exam, we had a 3-hour practical session doing such tests.
Okay. And which year did you undertake the MRC Path exam?
I finally achieved the MRC Path exam in 1982. So then I was fully accredited as a haematologist, but before that time I wasn't accredited.
We then move on to the Royal Free. If we could have up on screen, please, Henry, RLIT 000022. I'm putting this up as much as anything as an aid to memory, Professor Lee. This is a seminar you participated in, or helped organise, I think, in 1998. So when events would have been fresher in your mind.
I didn't just participate in it, I actually helped organise it.
And if we go to page 34, I think it is, Henry. 34. Oh, sorry, I'm using the internal pagination, so can you go on 10 pages? Thank you. So I just want to get a sense of practices at the Royal Free in the 1970s. Obviously aware that you weren't there, Professor Lee, but you've talked about it in this seminar. So we can see you ask the question, was it right to think that cryoprecipitate was a thing that really pushed home treatment? And then you go on to say, after Dr. Matthews responds, in our own centre, that's Royal Free, Catherine Dormandy really made a major contribution. I think I'm right in saying she made cryoprecipitate in the old hospital at Lawn Road in the labs there, and the patients were actually started on home treatment with cryoprecipitate. In fact, if you go back and look through the notes of some of our older patients, the social work contribution was to raise the money to buy the deep freezers, enabling them to have it at home. And then if we just go to the top of the next page before I ask a question, you then say...
Just give Professor Lee a
Oh, I'm so
moment.
sorry, Professor Lee.
She's trying to follow it both in the document and on the screen, so just...
Could you just...
Do you want to
Follow
start
it.
again?
Page 34 I've got.
I'm so sorry. So you ask a question about cryoprecipitate being a thing that really
Which
pushed
page
home
is
treatment.
that, please?
It's page 34, using the pagination in the bottom left-hand corner of the page. It is on the
Yes,
screen.
okay, sorry. Yeah, okay.
So you asked a question about cryoprecipitate.
Just a moment. You may find it easier to look at the screen. I don't know
Yes,
which you're easier working with.
Yeah. I think I know this book.
Okay.
As long as I have the page numbers,
Yes.
I'm fine.
So you asked that question. Dr. Matthews, who was at Oxford, responds about cryoprecipitate making a big difference because it was easily made, although he observes it wasn't the ideal material, but many centres found it a very useful material for home treatment. And then you made an observation about Catherine Dormandy, who'd been the director at the Royal Free in the 1970s, and you observed that cryoprecipitate was made in the labs at the Royal Free. Patients were started on home treatment with cryoprecipitate, and you refer to the notes of some of your older patients showing social work efforts to raise money to buy deep freezers. And then if we go to the top of the next page, so it's the top of page 35, you then say that in our centre we were a bit slow to use large full clotting factor concentrate because it wasn't really until you, that's Professor Tuddenham and Peter Kernoff, came that people started on this treatment because Catherine had been so taken up with the cryoprecipitate. Now, I can obviously ask Professor Tuddenham about this as well, but your understanding was that cryoprecipitate had been a significant part of the treatment policies of the centre in the 1970s under Dr. Dormandy.
Yes, I think I would like you to refer to this paper. I can give you the number if you like. Do you want the number
Yes,
now?
please.
It's the history paper that was written for the 50th anniversary of the KD Trust. And it's it's 644061.
I'm not sure it is, I'm afraid. I think
Well, all
it's
right.
changed.
Well, on my
Not your
witness,
fault at all, Professor Lee.
my witness statement, it's 0655067.
Yes.
Okay.
Blood-borne infections and
Yes.
haemophilia are the worst of times.
And this,
So, Professor Lee, can I ask you just to pause for a moment so we can get it up on screen so others can follow?
yeah, sure.
So, Henry, it's WITN 0644067. And which page would you like to refer to, Professor
Well,
Lee?
I think the first page is talking about Catherine Dormandy, and the references are very relevant, and you have these in my deposition. Catherine Dormandy pioneered making cryoprecipitate at the old Lawn Road Hospital, and the paper that describes that is Bennett et al. In 1967, referenced in this paper. I was actually working at the renal unit at the Royal Free when the old Lawn Road Hospital was there. So, and it was a two-storey old Victorian hospital, and she commandeered the whole of a haematology ward, the old haematology ward, to make the cryoprecipitate on site, and then eventually the North London Blood Transfusion Service took it over. And she pioneered home treatment with cryoprecipitate, and at that stage the Haemophilia Centre was a caravan that had been paid for by the Haemophilia Society in 1965, and she had about 6 beds at the end of a ward bay on the ground floor, and the patients with haemophilia would come up to that place if they needed treatment or bleeds or whatever. But they also came up eventually, when it went on to home treatment, to collect cryoprecipitate. And if you read in some of this paper of hers, she describes how in order to take the cryoprecipitate home, it needed to be kept cool. And she had card ice, and that was given to the patients, and they'd have cardboard boxes to kind of insulate this cryoprecipitate, because the problem with cryoprecipitate is that, factor 8 decays over 12 hours. So if you have cryoprecipitate, the actual amount of factor 8 in it depends on, one, the speed with which you get the blood that's taken out of the patient, to centrifuge it, to get off the plasma, to freeze that plasma down to a low temperature, and then warm it up to a slightly sort of 4 degrees, and then decant that over to another bag. This is a process, and she had this going in this haematology ward at Lawn Road. And then those bags have to be put in a deep freeze. And all this time, every time that material is out of freezing, the factor 8 is decaying. And then the patients who've driven, often those patients came from quite a distance to the Royal Free, they've got to take this home to put in their own deep freezers, if they've got a deep freeze. And they had these boxes, the homemade boxes that would be card ice put in and insulated to take them home. And all the time the factor 8 is decaying. And I think that is very well described in the paper, Bennett.
Thank you. So we have throughout the 1970s, Dr. Dormandy essentially establishing and operating a home treatment program using cryoprecipitate.
Actually, sorry, I'm sorry to. You asked me another question, didn't you? Before that. About that she was using cryoprecipitate, and Dr. Kernoff and Dr. Tuddenham.
I'm just going to come to that.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, no, don't worry. I'm going to come to that. So, Dr. Dormandy, Dr. Dormandy's post was taken over by Dr. Kernoff and Dr. Tuddenham in 1978. They were appointed co-directors of the Royal Free at that point.
Well, that's not entirely true. Peter Kernoff was initially appointed director, and I think he was interviewed by Catherine Dormandy, and then he took up a research. He was doing research, I think, in North America, and in the interim, Catherine Dormandy was diagnosed, and she had a terminal illness, and they then managed to get a senior lecturer post to be her replacement, although she hadn't actually died yet. And Dr. Tuddenham, or you can ask him about this tomorrow, but it's my understanding, and this understanding comes from Peter Kernoff, Dr. Tuddenham was appointed by the new professor of medicine, Professor Hofbrand, and he was made co-director in Peter Kernoff's absence. He was actually appointed as a senior lecturer. So I think at that stage, Peter Kernoff's understanding was he was director, and when he came back from America, he found out he was co-director.
If we look at your evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal again, Henry, it's LIND 0000362, please. And if we go to page 5, please, Henry. Actually, we'll just pick it up from the book to put it in context, the bottom of the previous page, the second half of the previous page. So if we pick it up down there, Professor Lee, we can see about just over halfway down the page, you were talking about Dr. Dormandy and the use of cryoprecipitate, and you referred to the notes and there being records of letters from social workers trying to get deep freezers and patients talking about having that treatment at home. And then you're asked the question at the bottom of the page for how long would the patients have continued to use cryoprecipitate for home treatment at the Royal Free. We go to the next page. You say that at the Royal Free they went on using it probably for longer than other places, and you've explained why Dr. Dormandy was very enthusiastic about cryoprecipitate. And then you say the two co-directors were put in. They were young doctors and they came in 1978 and very rapidly changed everybody to concentrate. There have been some people who'd had concentrate before then, but I would think that up until 1978, the majority were probably still on cryoprecipitate. And then you're asked about this being a change of policy, and you answer yes. What understanding did you have from subsequent conversations or discussions or however you gained it about the reasons for this change of policy? Why did they switch very rapidly to concentrates?
I think you should ask Professor Tuddenham that question tomorrow. I just need to go back a bit about Catherine Dormandy and why she was so enthusiastic about continuing cryoprecipitate was because she'd made it and she'd pioneered home treatment. And also she, and this is listed in the bloodborne infections paper, she'd done a study with some American workers in North America, in Worcester in the United States. And they were treated exclusively with the new concentrates, whereas Catherine Dormandy was treating people with cryoprecipitate. And what she found was that while both groups of patients, so that's the people on the concentrates in North America and the people receiving just cryoprecipitate at the Royal Free, while both groups of patients had raised transaminases, that's the liver function test, this was more common in those treated with concentrate. This was subsequently shown to be due to hepatitis C. And in the comment at the end of this paper, published in 1977, Dormandy noted the long-term significance of the various abnormalities recorded here is unknown. Aggressive therapy should continue. And I don't know. I think you have to ask Professor Tuddenham, but I think probably it was the convenience and the efficiency. And so when you treat people with the concentrate, I described this fall of the factor 8 making cryoprecipitate, let alone everything you needed to use this at home, and also to draw it up in hospital. I'm sure that it was the much more effective treatment for bleeding, and that's probably what drove them to changing people. And it wasn't just them, it was the patients asking for it and the whole of the treatment community. I think it's important to digress again, if you will allow me. I just want to expand a bit about cryoprecipitate. It comes in a plastic bag, and it's a very sticky solution. And when people treated themselves at home, if they, say, had a bleed, which they would need probably 10 bags of this. So the process of this was using 2 big syringes and having to draw this stuff into a syringe. And the volume that the patient had to then, they were taught how to self-infuse, and you imagine it's not easy. The volume was enormous. Not only was the volume enormous, but the efficiency, the amount of factor 8 in it, you didn't know exactly how much factor 8 was in it. It depended on how long that whole process I've described to you took. You know, it also depended on the factor 8 in the original donor, and some transfusion centres even got people running upstairs to raise the factor 8 in the plasma. So when the concentrates came, you had 2 little bottles, and it was a very small, much smaller volume. And you actually knew how much was being given. So you knew how much the patient would have in his bloodstream. It also meant that people could take the bottles to work, or they could go on holiday. You know, this has been virtually unheard of because you had to have a deep freeze full of cryoprecipitate. So I think that was the reason that there was the complete change, and I don't think they could be criticised for that at that time.
Okay, I note the time, sir. Is this a convenient point at which to take a break?
It is, yes. We take a break in the mornings. It'll be 45 minutes. That allows everyone to have a proper socially distanced refreshment. So we start again, shall we, at 12 o'clock?
Yes, and if
now,
you could give...
Professor Lee, you're giving evidence. The rule is that in a break, you must not discuss your evidence, either the evidence you have given or you suspect you may be asked to give, with anyone. That includes those near to you, it includes counsel, it includes family, but you can talk about anything else you like. I'll see you at 12.
Okay, thank you.